Chapter 2. It had chanced, while Olaf was in England, that Eirik had received full assurance that he was true born. He had had to go up to Ringel one day with a packload, cups and vessels that Olaf had borrowed for his wife's funeral feast. Now they had a very snappish little bitch tied up in the yard there, and that day she had slipped out of her thong, dashed up and bitten Eirik in the leg as he came in between the houses. Eirik kicked the bitch so that she rolled over on the grass, howling. Torgrim rushed out of the door in a great rage. "Afraid of a little dog like that, and kicking at a bitch? No one but a child of Bawdry such as you would do the like." Eirik had come into the hall, and Una was counting over her vessels. Then the lad burst out. "Una, those words that Torgrim said, are they true?" "Are what true?" she repeated from among her wooden cups. "Child of Bawdry. That is the same as Horsan, isn't it, Una?" whispered Eirik. "Yes. Why?" She looked up and saw the lad standing there, pale as bast, his narrow young face stricken with despair. "Holy Mary, what ails you, Eirik?" "Am I that? Answer me truly, Una mine." Una Arnestata stood speechless. "Ah, I guessed it long ago," whispered Eirik. "What did you guess? Are you not ashamed to say such a thing of your father and your mother who lies under the sod? Help us, what have you taken into your head now? You must have heard Torgrim say it. Father himself called me bastard once." "You may be sure," said Una more gently. "Neither of the two would have called you such bad names if you had been so. Surely you have wit enough to see that it was only the word of an angry man." "Then was mother married to father?" asked Eirik. "You have no need to ask that. Olaf kept the poor woman in good and honourable state so long as she lived. You can have seen nothing else." "He took the keys from her and gave them to his leman," muttered Eirik. "That was a year and more ere mother lost her health." "Say no more of that, boy." Una turned red with indignation. "You do not understand it. I will speak no ill of your mother, poor soul that she was. It was not her fault that her kinsman dealt falsely by Olaf. Still less that she was as she was, sickly and feeble-minded. None could expect a man to be well pleased with such a marriage as fell to the lot of our kinsman. Scarce had the Steinfinnsons gotten the rich heir into their power when they bound the little boy in bonds of betrothal on one of their own children. And then they cheated him of all he should have received with his bride. Never has Olaf had help or honour of that alliance. But he was forced to take the ailing woman, for they had trapped him into her bed ere he was fully grown." Una talked thus for a good while, and said what she thought of Olaf's married life. She was faithful to her own kin, and fond of Olaf as though he had been her brother. But although she had always been helpful and kind to his wife, she had had but a moderate liking for Ingunn, and in her heart she had called her a worm. Together with Eirik's first sense of boundless relief on knowing that no one could drive him away from Hestviken, there came a smouldering indignation against his father. He might have spared himself these years of anxious insecurity, but it was his father's fault. So barefaced had he been in his evil life with that cursed jade, Torhild, that it was only natural Eirik should fear the worst. Wrong, wrong, wrong had his mother suffered under her own roof. Eirik spent that summer at Hestviken. Every corner of the old walls, every crack in the smooth-worn reddish-grey rocks, had a face that met his loving glances with a look of gentle kindness. The strip of seaweed under his own rocks looked different from seaweed elsewhere. No other wharves or boats smelt so good as theirs. When he took up the oars in his own boat, or put out his nets, His whole body was filled with delight. He owned them. He caressed every animal he met that was theirs. Eirik took an ear of barley and laid it on his wrist over the pulse so that it crawled up under the sleeve. This old child's game had become a sort of magic ceremony. It was his corn. He need no longer be afraid as he lived and moved among all these things. They would never vanish away out of his hands. Eirik's memory of his mother had quickly faded. In her last years, when she never left her bed, she had already passed out of the boy's world. After her death, he had soon ceased to think of her. Now that he was so indignant with his father, he felt an added resentment on his mother's behalf. His affection for her awakened. He often longed for her. He had been so fond of her as long as she was well and he could be with her. And his father had treated her so harshly and cruelly. But it only needed a friendly word from Olav, and Eirik forgot all his bitterness. Afterwards he remembered it and was angry at his own weakness. But no sooner did the man show him the least indulgence, no sooner did Eirik see but a shadow of the pale, frozen smile on his father's lips as he spoke to him, than the son became insensible to all but his abject adoration of his father. A short time after Olav's return from England, Eirik heard the rumours that he was to marry Dissa Erlendsdatter. Up at Rundmere they gossiped freely about everything. Eirik's temper rebelled again. He would not have a stepmother. He would not hear of joint heirs in Hestviken. No strangers should come, bringing new customs or anything new. All should be his and Cecilia's, the manor and the wharf and the woods on the Bull and along the back of the Horse Crag, Kverndal and Saltviken. He knew every path there. He had his own places, outlooks, and hidden grassy hollows among the grey rocks toward the sea. His habit was to go there, simply to sit alone, rejoicing vaguely and obscurely in the possession of these hiding places. The hunting in the forest, the sealing, the fishery, all this would one day be in his control. But the last and inmost thought, which always made him mad with passion, for he knew he had no power to hinder its coming to pass, was that one day another might come between him and his father. He even spun long fabulous dreams of the deed that would one day make him his father's favourite. The seal hunting well nigh failed that year, and Olav lost a good new 6-oared boat out in the Skerries. The painter was cut one night, whether it were the work of an enemy or someone had stolen the boat. So Olav came home from sea in a gloomy temper, even for him. Some days after, he had business which took him inland, and Eirik was to accompany him as far as the church. It was a Wednesday in the Ember days, and Sira Halbjorn insisted that all who could should attend church in the Ember days. The frost fog was thick that morning and left a film of ice on rocks and woodwork. Olav stood outside the stable door while Eirik led out the horses and was about to saddle them. Olav was standing there, sleepy and dazed and fasting, when suddenly he turned to his son and said hotly, "Will you not rub the bit before you put it in the horse's mouth in this searing cold?" "It's not cold," replied Eirik sullenly. "'Tis only the raw weather that feels cold." "Hold your tongue! Will you teach me to judge of the weather? If you had that scorching cold iron in your own jaws—" Eirik snatched an iron rod that was stuck in the stable wall and bit on it. His father pulled it from him and flung it on the rocks. "You see, you are bleeding." "It was not that scorched me. You tore my mouth." "Be silent," said Olav curtly, "and have done now." About midday some of the church folk sat in the priest's house taking a bite of the food they had brought before setting out for home. The wound at the corner of Eirik's mouth began to bleed again, and he told some of the other lads how he had got it. But he said it was his father who had taken the bit and forced it into his jaws. Then he noticed that the silence which followed was heavy with scorn. At last a boy said, "Shame on you, Eirik. Do you let your father make a jade of you?" Eirik looked around, hesitating. He had meant to boast of what had befallen him. When he noticed the scorn on the other faces, something seemed to shrivel up within him. So he decided to make up for it. "No, but indeed it were useless for me to stand up against him," he said, warming with excitement. "I can tell you, I pulled off the halter and struck at him. But he has the strength of a troll, my father. One time, while he was with the Earl, they made wagers how big a load he could lift. Father put his shoulders under the bench and raised himself till he stood upright. 8 men sat on that bench. He was met with icy silence. Then the Earl said, 'If you can lift the tabletop, Olav Audunsson, it shall be yours, with all the silver that stands upon it.' My father took the table and lifted it at arm's length." "It's almost like the story you told us last year, Sire Halbjorn," said a young girl with a giggle, "of that Christian knight who was a captive with the Saracen Earl. What was his name?" There was a hearty laugh from some of the grown people. Sire Halbjorn was sitting apart on his bed. That day he was neither surly nor frolicsome, seemed rather dull. He looked coldly at the maid. "You remember, Sire Halbjorn, at my brother's wedding?" "I know no such story. Your memory is at fault." But a little later, when folk were breaking up, the priest came abruptly behind Eirik Olafsson and took him firmly by the arm. "What is your meaning with such talk? Do you tell lies about your father?" "No, I didn't lie, Sire," Eirik answered coolly. "You lied." Sire Halbjorn gave him a blow under the ear. "And now you lie to your parish priest. The devil is in you, I believe. Be off with you now." At dusk, Olav Audunsson rode up to the priest's door. He would not go in, he said. It was too late. Sitting in the saddle, he handed Sire Halbjorn the casket of letters and turned to ride away at once. Sire Halbjorn came out and walked at his side, as Olaf rode at a foot's pace between the fences. "Master Olaf," said the priest hotly, "you should not suffer your son to assort with those folk you have thought fit to set up at Rundmere. It will do the boy no good, what he learns there." Olaf didn't know what to reply to this. As he said nothing, the priest continued, repeating what Eirik had said of his father. "He makes himself a mockery in the eyes of the whole parish, your son, by lying in this fashion, and lying so foolishly." Meanwhile they had come to the crossroads, and the priest laid his hand on Olaf's bridle and held it, as he looked up into the other's face. There was still a glimmer of daylight within the mist, which was gathering again. Olaf saw with surprise that the priest seemed greatly agitated. "I cannot guess why Eirik should say that." Olaf told him what had taken place between him and his son that morning. "Ah, yes, so it goes, when the young have bad masters." Olaf frowned and puckered his lips in a sort of smile, but made no answer. Eirik hardly needed a master to teach him lying. That talent he was surely born with. "Had any wise man counselled my father, as I now counsel you," said Sire Halbjorn, "then he had taken me away from the house where I was fostered after mother died. I was a pious child when I was with her. She had vowed me to God while I was yet unborn. But then father sent me to a foster father, and he was of the Lappish race." "Do there dwell Lapps in Valdres?" asked Olaf. He felt he ought to say something. The priest nodded. "I saw many a strange thing as I grew up, Olaf. They are the most excellent hunters, the Lapps, and divers creatures are abroad in the mountains, both beasts and men, and others. Since then it goes ill with me to live elsewhere. I didn't yearn to return here during the years I was in foreign lands, resorting to one school after another. But these folk hereabouts, they provoke me so that I lose patience." "So it seems." Olav could not forbear to smile a little mockingly. "Yes," said the priest hotly, "it is not good to dwell in these parts." "You have no friends here either, Olav." "So it seems," said Olav again. "But I don't know if it be because, well, maybe folk are no different here than elsewhere." "Have you ever taken part in hunting reindeer?" asked Sire Halbjorn abruptly. "At the old deer pits among the fells? Have you seen the reindeer herd on the move, many thousand of them?" "No," said Olav. "I have never seen a living reindeer." "Bear me company sometime." There was almost an entreaty in the priest's voice, so eager was he. "When I go home to visit my brothers." "I thank you, Sire Halbjorn. Should the occasion suit, I would gladly bear you company one day." They took leave of one another. But the priest said once more, "But keep Eirik from Rundmere. If not, they will trick the lad into a share of their stealings, or father's some wench's brat on him before he is 2 years older. And you would be ill-served with that, both of you, Olav." Olav thought deeply over his talk with the priest as he rode down in the dark. He felt something like disappointment. Not that he had any quarrel with his parish priest. On the contrary, he was one of the few men in the district who had not yet been in conflict with him. But he too had thought that there was some secret about Sire Halbjorn. And then his being exiled, as it were, to this parish, outside all the positions and dignities to which he might be entitled by his high birth and his learning. So Olav had half expected that one day something or other would come to light about him. And now it seemed nothing but this, that Halbjorn Erlingsson thrived ill down here in the lowlands, and found it hard to be friends with their people, being headstrong and whimsical as fell dwellers often are. No doubt it was little to his liking to have the quiet charge of a parish church, and be at the call of any who had need of his ministrations. Formerly Olaf had instinctively sought the company of such men as he felt to be pure of heart and faithful toward God. Without thinking of it, he had shunned the black sheep when he met them. Now he felt just as much at his ease among men who were less strict, who had the name, in any case, of being not too strict with themselves, though for anything he cared they might judge others strictly. In a way he was not displeased at heart to find some fault or other in a man, especially if it were a priest or a monk. Nor did he ever inquire into rumours now. He held his peace when the talk was of such things, but lent an ear, and that no longer with repugnance or sensitiveness. He thought too of what Sire Halbjorn had said about Eirik, and it vexed him. But he did not care to speak to the boy about it. Much better seem to know nothing. But he would have to forbid the boy haunting Rundmere. And he did so, but Eirik did not obey. Olaf came to hear of it. Sometimes he spoke harshly to his son about it, but at other times he let it pass, as though he did not know Eirik had been there. He had acted foolishly in letting Anki and Liv have Rundmere. If they would only keep to what was his, that he could afford to wink at. But now there were rumours abroad. Folk found that there were light fingers at Rundmere. At last Olaf had to take Aunt Ketil to task about it. "I think you two might live a while on what you pick up at Hestviken." The man promised to mend his ways, but Olaf was not so sure that the promise was worth much. And now it might be difficult to be rid of them. When Aunt Ketil came and asked him to hold their babe at the font, he had not the heart to refuse the poor simple man. Moreover, he thought that, if he agreed to be godfather to the boy, no one could suspect him of commerce with the mother. It never entered Olaf's mind that, so far as he knew, no one had had such a thought. It was only himself who feared folk might hit upon this. There had been a hint of it when she had had her first child, but then he was common talk over the matter of Thorhild, and there were always those who are ready to make a man blacker than he is. But by accepting the godchild, he had now bound himself to support its parents. To Eirik, Arnketil had been in some way a sort of foster father, so it was not easy to part the lad entirely from him. And Liv came out to Hestviken with her babe on her back, stayed there the whole day, dealing out good advice to the serving women and talking of how everything had been done when she was in charge. Thorhild had turned out right in saying he acted unwisely in housing such people so near to the manor. Olaf thought of it with a dull bitterness, that he could be so placed that he could not bring in Thorhild and profit by her sensible advice. It was a vexation to Olaf that Eirik forced himself thus upon his notice and his thoughts. And again he came upon this incomprehensible mendacity. Each time it was like a riddle to Olaf. He had told lies himself, hard and cold enough to split rocks. He had not forgotten that, but then he had known why he had lied. He had lied because he was forced to it. But Eirik lied, and his father could never espy anything that looked like a plausible reason. He did not lie for gain, and he seldom lied for concealment. Olaf had seen that, although he had not been so careful to note how seldom Eirik attempted to deny or to lie if he were asked a straight question. The lad was quite ready to confess even his worst misdeeds. Falteringly, blushing and blinking, he said how it was if he were asked. So it was almost as though Eirik made up these lying stories of his because it amused him, incomprehensible as such a thing seemed to Olaf. Year in and year out, Olaf's feelings for the child had swung between a vague longing to be able to like this young being who had been placed in his power, and dislike of this stranger who was as a thorn buried in his flesh. Now at last they were coming to rest for good. There were times when Eirik's incomprehensible and positively high-spirited mendacity aroused hatred in Olaf's heart, as though the very lie he had taken upon himself as a yoke were incarnate in Eirik's person, mocking him in the smile of the fairy-like brown-eyed boy. Nevertheless, there were other times when it was not so. This second summer, after his wife's death, Olaf had to attend the Icelander. He was short-handed now at Hestviken, and could not easily take any man from his work. So it came about that Eirik was to ride with his father. Olaf had little mind to this long journey, nor had he any great desire to meet his brother-in-law. He had not been north of Oslo in all the 13 years since he had brought home Ingunn, except that one time when he fetched Eirik, and then it had been winter. Now he took the summer road northward through Raumarik. It was fine sunny weather, but warm for travelling in the middle of the day, so they found a suitable place near the road. Eirik unsaddled the horses and hobbled them. After their meal, Olaf and Eirik stretched themselves on the ground. The lad fell asleep at once. Olaf lay with his head on his saddle, gazing before him through the tissue of grass. The meadow was golden yellow with buttercups, flower upon flower, and round the little brown watercourse below were silvery tufts of bog cotton. Beyond the brook blazed a mass of red campion in the shade of the alders. He looked at the flowers as though they were old acquaintances he had met again after an interval of years. It was true, he noticed at home too when this grass or that came out, taking auguries from it of how the summer would turn out. But here, as he lay idly watching the flowers blooming upon land of which he knew not the owner, it was different, bringing back to him in some measure the tracts in which he had spent his youth. Great silver-grey clouds shining at the verge welled up over the fir tops and spread quietly and with wonderful swiftness over the whole warm blue sky. Down on the ground not a breath stirred. Now they came over and put out the sunshine. Olaf drew his cloak over his face to keep out the midges and slept. In the course of the afternoon they came out of a forest and saw a great manor lying before them under the sinking sun. It looked like some great man's seat there on the top of its mound, with a little white stone church to the north of the group of houses and the meadows surrounding it on every side. Eirik cried out with joy, so grand it seemed to him. Olaf made no reply to his exclamation. The bridle path led up the hill and straight through the manor. This was no less imposing when they came up to it, with countless houses, new and old, in 2 rows by the side of the way, and every sign of activity and habitation. When they had come down into the valley and were riding by the bank of a river, Olaf asked Eirik, "Do you know what that manor is called, Eirik?" "No," asked the boy eagerly. "That was different." "Was it?" After a while, Eirik said in a hushed voice with strong emotion, "We should have been there if we had our rights. Is that not so, father?" "So it is." Olaf rode in silence for a few moments. Then he asked with a sort of smile, "Which of the 2 manors do you like best, Eirik? Different or Hestviken?" "Hestviken," answered Eirik warmly, without hesitation. "Different is more than twice as large. You can see that." "Doesn't matter. At Different they don't have the sea either, or wharves or boats. It is galling to call to mind the injustice. I think a man who works so much injustice to the landholders of the country as that's fair, he should not be fitted to be king." "Some injustice must be done by every man who will gain his cause," replied Olaf. Eirik wished to hear of the old traditions, of Thorgils Fyvel and his sons, and of the widow whom King Sverre gave to one of his men. Olaf replied to his questions. But then they saw the road lying before them across a sandy plain, level and easy, and Olaf urged on the horses. With that, their talk came to an end. Halvard Steinfinnsson gave a hearty welcome both to his brother-in-law and to his nephew. With the passing of years, Halvard had grown very like his father, Olaf saw, and he also resembled Steinfinn in his ways. He was merry, open-handed, and not over-wise. He had the eldest son of Tora and Hakon Gautson with him at the thing. Eirik had looked forward with great joy to meeting his mother's kindred, but although they were so friendly to him, Eirik seemed unusually shy, and he kept close to his father at all times and places while the thing lasted. Quite unexpectedly, Olaf met his kinsman from Hvit in Soljar at the gathering. Gudbrand and Jon Helgason with 2 sons and a son-in-law. Olaf had only met the men of Hvit once before. At the time he was engaged in discharging the fines for the slaying of Einar Kolbeinsson, and then he had thought they gave themselves little trouble for a young kinsman. Now they were getting on in years, both he and the Helgasons, and it seemed late to take up the ties of kinship. But he exchanged words with them when they met. And on one of the last days of the gathering, when Halvard had asked Olaf to come and drink with him at his inn, he found the men of Hvit there. Halvard had fetched them in to show courtesy to his brother-in-law. Halvard lodged in the same house as Steinfinn had used when he came to the thing. Olaf did not remember it. He was not sure that this hall they now sat drinking in was the same in which they had betrothed him to Ingunn. Apart from that, he remembered everything so clearly. Ingunn and Steinfinn and his own father. He scarce remembered his father, apart from that evening. And many of the guests' faces he could recall as though it were yesterday. Olaf was very taciturn the whole evening, but the others paid no heed to that. They drank, and at last they seemed entirely to forget that he sat there. But what chiefly occupied Olaf's attention was Eirik. He kept so quiet, and was utterly unlike himself, as they were used to seeing him at home. The lad sat on the outer bench together with the younger ones from Veit. Olaf looked at him. Old feelings, by no means unfriendly, were strangely revived in him. During the journey Eirik had not chanced to do anything which might irritate his father, and he sat there now very quiet and well-mannered, talking easily in low tones with Knut and Joar. The dark-skinned, sharp-featured, boyish face was beginning to put on a maturer look. The forehead was high and narrow under the shock of black hair. The nose was high and thin, hooked, or rather indented, from the very root down to the bridge. The mouth was prominent with a pronounced curve in the upper jaw. When listening he was apt to show something of his front teeth, and they were very white. The two midmost were very slightly crossed. Nevertheless his face was far from ugly. He had a fine complexion, red-cheeked and browned by the sun, the lips bright red, the eyes unusually large and pale brown, so light that they made one think of amber or bog water in sunlight. Olaf felt, as a fleeting quiver through his mind, that here he sat in company with his own kinsman and brother-in-law, and he found little to say to them. And underneath the honest open ties which bound him to the others, the ties of blood and of the law, he was joined to this slender swarthy lad, who sat like a stranger among the fair red Veit boys. He knew not himself how indissolubly. Halvard had wine, and so it was near midnight before the guests broke up. It was a half-hour's walk down to the booth where Olaf lay, and at the parting of the roads he stood a while talking to some men who were going the other way. Then he walked on quickly with Eirik. The night was mild, and so light that the moon seemed quite pale and faint. When they had gone some distance they heard the men of Veit before them on the road. They were drunken and noisy, and Olaf had no desire for their company. So he turned out of the path with Eirik, and they strolled along the hillside, which was covered with great rocks and juniper and other bushes. A few horses grazed among the tussocks in the moonlight. They came out upon some little crags, and beneath them lay a great bog which would be tiresome to go round, so Olaf sat down to let the Veit folk get ahead. But now it sounded as if they had come to a halt on the path just below here. They made no move, and Gudbrand vomited with loud retching, while the others formed a ring and made sport of him. Eirik lay on his stomach on the close-cropped grass, laughing quietly and mimicking to his father the words and noises that came up from below. "Look at the moon, father," said Eirik, floating on its back above the tree-tops in the west, with a few thin strips of golden cloud lying under it. Near it was a great star, blazing alone in the pale blue sky. "Yes," said Olaf, "we shall have wind." "It looks like a ship," said Eirik, laughing quietly at his own idea, "sailing on the sea, and the big star is like a dog running after the ship." "Ah, Eirik," Olaf could not help smiling. "How can a dog run after a ship that sails on the sea?" "Oh, yes," said the boy eagerly. "They have left it behind, and now it runs along the shore, in and out among the headlands, barking and howling after the boat." The boy's words reminded Olaf of something. He had once heard or dreamt something like this about a dog that ran along the shore, wailing after a ship that had sailed away. A dog or a man that had been left behind. He looked down at the lad's upturned face. Quite pale it seemed in the twilight, and the wide open eyes were dark in the shadow. It was as though the man, in moving, had tightened the invisible bond between them. "Of the noise of cats treading, and the beards of women, and the roots of the rocks, and the breath of the fishes, and spittle of the birds. It was a rigmarole he had known as a child, of someone who had forged a chain, and it was more pliant than silk and bound faster than fetters of steel. A wild beast was to stay bound in it till doomsday. It was quiet down on the road. "Come," said Olaf, and unconsciously he let his hand drop on the boy's shoulder, and kept it there a moment. They went down and found the path again. Of the Veit folk they saw no more, and reached without delay the booth where Olav had hired night quarters for them. The bed was exceedingly narrow. Eirik fell asleep at once, and very soon he turned over in his sleep, so that he almost lay on the top of his father. In the narrow, uncomfortable couch, with the darkness around, thick with the smell of men, Olaf lay feeling the pressure of Eirik's thin, slender body, and the warm scent of his skin and hair, without distaste, with an unreasoning sense of pity. Though only God and his blessed mother could tell why he should have compassion on Eirik. He knew of nothing to make him pity his son, but it was as though the lad's very youth made him soft-hearted. Though that is a fault one soon grows out of, thought Olaf. Olaf got no proper sleep, but lay, as it were, rolling back and forth between sleep and waking, like a piece of driftwood on the beach. But after an hour or two, when he heard some men moving in the other rooms, Olaf gently withdrew from beside the sleeping lad, and went out to see to the horses himself. He had not the heart to wake the boy.